Terraria, 2D Minecraft is a classic. Good combat for those who min-max the shit out of potions and still get demolished by bosses. Building fuck-tech mages who can finally put their deployment to good use. And of course tons and tons and tons of Guna content for all of you sick fucks. I've got fond memories of the game, being one of the first games I played when I got my 360, to when my retarded ass put controller through a TV because of these fuckers. A couple of weeks back I revisited the game. During this little reunion, I took a moment to let the innertism appreciate just how good this game looks. It's so simple looking yet so visually appealing. One of my personal favourite effects from a graphical standpoint is the water. Just how dynamic and lively it feels, yet how simple the effect looks. So, like any normal person who doesn't have a job, I set out to figure out how this graphical effect was achieved. To start with, we need to break down the components of the effect. Looking at it, we see it seems to be split into two separate pieces, the upper surface of the water and the displacement it undergoes to create waves, and the body of water itself that seems to have this ripple effect. If we can recreate and combine these two elements, we should be able to replicate what we see in the game. We'll start by focusing on the main body of the water. We can see that the effect isn't just smoke and mirrors, as we can see the ripples dynamically interact and interfere with each other. This meaning that the element is likely simulated. With a bit of research, the simulation in question is likely to be a ripple sim. The sim begins with two buffers, buffer 1 and buffer 2. We select a pixel on the second buffer, we then gather the values of its neighbouring pixels on the first buffer and sum them together, dividing the total by 2. We then subtract the value of the selected pixel in the second buffer. Finally, we apply a damping factor, typically around 0.99, to the result. We then feed this final value into the selected pixel in the second buffer and repeat this process for every other pixel inside of the second buffer. We then display the second buffer to the screen and swap the two buffers around. This whole algorithm is repeated each subsequent frame, giving us our sim. Now that we know the theory and pseudocode behind the sim, let's actually implement it into OpenGL. We'll start by creating a unit quad with an attached vertex and fragment shader, rendering out a quad onto the screen. We'll then generate a 512 by 512 image texture, we'll then send it through to a fragment shader of the quad to be displayed by the shader. Now for the actual sim itself, we'll begin by creating a compute shader writing out the majority of what was shown in the pseudocode. However, instead of sending through two buffers as laid out in the method, we'll send through our generated texture to the compute shader, having the red channel of our texture act as the first buffer and the green channel act as the second buffer. This greatly simplifies our setup and reduces unnecessary data sends. Now you can see our buffers never get swapped in the shader, as if we were to swap them around whilst we compute the simulation, the results will get completely fucked as pixels in the first buffer get changed before the second buffer finishes calculating all its pixels. To rectify this, all we need is a separate compute shader that runs after this shader, and we'll cycle through each pixel on our texture and swap the red and green channels around, swapping the buffers. If we run this, having the sim run on a fixed update loop is to keep its time constant, we'll still see a black texture be rendered. This because we haven't actually introduced a value into the sim yet. To do this, it's as simple as changing a pixel's value to anything other than 0. Doing this, we now see ripples occur. This setup, when paired with a better draw to the texture, creates results that are generally quite effective, especially for the cheap cost to run it. However, the reason these ripples are less desirable is they aren't actually physically accurate. It's a good approximation of waves, but not perfect, failing to factor in influences like velocity. Expansion to include true-to-life physics is, however, not all that complex. We'll start by outlining a new format for our texture. The red channel will now store height, and the green channel will store velocity, where we can then use the velocity to more dynamically change height. We'll also define a new variable on top of that, labeled wave speed. We'll first start by changing the notation of our source, now storing the height and velocity of our current pixel. Sourcing the neighbours can largely remain the same as we need their heights stored in that red channel that we're already sourcing from. We'll get rid of everything after that and write out a variable called a Laplacian, equal to the sum of all of our neighbour heights, subtracted by 4 and multiplied by the height of our current pixel. To explain what's happening here, you can envision the texture and the values on it as constructing a curved plane. The Laplacian here acts to take an average of the neighbouring curvature points and returns a value dependent on that local curvature that can be used to accelerate our wave and ensure our wave actually oscillates up and down. Using this variable, we can then update our velocity, summing onto it the product between c squared, the Laplacian, and delta time. Then with our height variable, we sum onto it our calculated velocity multiplied by delta time, progressing the height and ultimately oscillating the wave. We'll also apply the damping factor onto the velocity, allowing it to have natural decay and prevent forever oscillation. We can now pass HV back into their respective channels, updating the sim. Now the interesting thing about this change is that the buffer ping-ponging we were doing originally isn't necessary now. We can just pass through the updated HV variables into the red and green channels and the sim runs correctly. This does however come with a caveat of added noise to the ripples, a trade-off for better performance as we don't need an extra run through of the texture with that transfer shader. We can slightly reduce the noise by creating a variable, diffusion, and adding onto the height the product between the diffusion, Laplacian, and delta time. You may remember that the water itself is a combination of two parts, the main body that we just covered and the upper surface that would move when the water was interacted with. Thankfully, this part is much less complex than the previous. We can achieve this effect of the water inside of the vertex shader, sending through that same sim texture and sampling it where the vertex is, adding to the vertex's y-coordinate the product between the sample value and an amplifier. We only want this to occur on the upper vertices, so we must multiply this value with the vertex's UV y-coordinate so only the top vertices receive displacement. However, we don't see much going on, and this is because if we're running off of displacing vertices, we're not going to get much displacement if we don't have many vertices. So all we have to do is add more geometry to the upper edge, and in more places displacement can occur and finally giving us these nice waves we've been after. Our result is good and all, but it don't look anything like water, so let's fix that. Our first task is going to be to make the water blue. Shocker, I know. So after spending a little too long trying to find the perfect hue, back in the fragment shader we can establish two colours, the base water colour and the ripple colour. We then mix these two together using the red channel of our texture as the factor. We can then take this colour and display it. We can add foam to the surface of the water by establishing a foam colour and foam threshold, where we'll then check if the pixel's YUV is within that threshold. If so, it gets drawn as a foam colour. This result looks better but still lacks life and looks a little too uniform, so to resolve this we can send through a noise texture to the fragment shader and sample it, summing that value onto the mix factor. This resulting area is a noise, now also displaying as the ripple colour. We can then pass through a time uniform and corresponding scalar to this shader and use the two to offset the sample position of the noise, causing the noise to pan down. Multiply the noise by the UV y coordinate and we can also have it fade as it progresses downwards. Repeat this same sampling idea inside of the vertex shader and instead sum the value onto the displacement, adding variation to the surface of the water also. And that's basically it. An effect crafted with simulations and shaders for a dynamic and convincing result. It's good to keep in mind that this effect can take some fine tuning to get looking right. As with many sims, it's prone to fall into breakdowns if conditions are pushed too extreme. On screen are the values I used to get this shown result, but I'm sure with some extra tuning, this could look even better. There are a few extra ideas I will cover but can't be asked to edit, such as how non-uniform bodies of water will work, likely by having a texture that encompasses the whole body even if there's wasted space, how the sim texture should respond to changes in the size of that body of water, to general optimizations like how large the texture should be, especially to keep everything constant in size and quality. But I'ma just leave it there for now. So if you found this shit interesting, please consider throwing a like or sub. Cheers for watching, and I'll be back again soon for more autistic schizo ramblings.